Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? I'd like to begin our program. In order to expedite matters, I'd like to start. I know some of you are still finishing that wonderful dessert that was John Marshall's favorite. After tasting it, I can understand why. But before introducing our program for the evening, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank some of the people that made this evening a very special event. First, duty dictates that I acknowledge the contributions of Professor Gene Edward Smith, author of John Marshall, Definer of a Nation, which most historians regard as the definitive biography on the great Chief Justice. As many of us here know, Professor Smith is the John Marshall Professor of Political Science and a John D. Verdrinko Distinguished Fellow here at Marshall. And I'm recognizing Gene because in preparing the narrative for this presentation, I egregiously usurped much of his powerful prose, and moreover, Professor Smith willingly read the narrative, made meaningful suggestions for its improvement, and most importantly, forgave me my transgressions. Gene, would you please stand and be recognized? And it's equally my pleasure to introduce Christine, his beautiful wife, who takes care of him. Christine, would you stand? Tonight we are presenting an exciting and very special program. Many members of the Marshall community have participated in this spectacular presentation. Their names and titles and contributions are listed in the inside face of your program. They include, for the historical visual presentation, Adrian Lawson, Eric Himes, and James Lafiego. For the staging of the event, as well as all the other events we've had during our celebration this week, we owe it to James Morris Smith, Deborah Carter-Deem, and Kevin Bannon. And again, James Morris Smith, you look around tonight, I've traveled to every table here, I think, tonight, and everybody said, you've just outdone yourself. Where are you? He's upstairs somewhere. There he is. Thank you. And for tonight's musical presentation, I'm pleased to introduce for the first time John Marshall's own Harmony Musicale. Speaking for the ensemble is Professor Wendel Dobbs. Wendel is responsible for the background music of our highly successful documentary on the life of John Marshall, and resulting from that, the publication of the marvelous CD entitled Rallying Around Our Liberty, which each of you have received as a special birthday favor honoring John Marshall. It's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Wendel Dobbs.
Thank you, Alan, and it's a pleasure and honor to be here and to play for you this evening. We have a program of music that's from the era of John Marshall, just as the recording features music from the era of John Marshall. And just for starters, I wanted to just introduce my colleagues. These are all my fellow colleagues in the Department of Music, and we're having a great time doing this. We're also all playing on a number of historically accurate instruments. So we're trying to not only play the music, but play it as if it would have been played during the era. So way over on the far end is Dr. Ben Miller. Ben, are you standing yet? No, oh, now you're standing. Okay, sorry. And Ben is playing his Revolutionary era side drum. It's quite loud, right? You'll hear later on. And next to him, playing the harpsichord, is Kay Wildman. And Kay actually was responsible for most of the arranging that happened on the music that you heard on the John Marshall documentary. I just sort of went along for the ride playing the flute. But she was responsible for most of that. And she certainly gets an A in harmony. And next to her is Stephen Lawson. Stephen is playing the natural horn. This is, you see, it's like the French horn, but it has no valves. This is what was played in the 17th, 18th, and really in the 19th centuries. Steve is also our interim chair in the Department of Music, so any questions you might have about the department, or simply if you just want to blame him, he's the one to talk to. So. Next to him is Kay Lawson, his better half, and she's playing the bassoon. The bassoon is the instrument which is the most unchanged instrument in the woodwinds. Next to her is Leslie Pettis, who is playing the forte piano, not to be confused with the pianoforte. And so this is an instrument that was recently created. It is her own instrument and it is just beautiful. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to remember the maker, but in any case, you can ask her afterwards and she'll tell you. But it's a wonderful instrument. We're pleased that she let us bring it here and that she's playing it this evening. And then finally, here on the end is Reed Smith, who's playing violin. And she's playing actually with an 18th century bow. It's a little bit shorter, and so a little bit different sound. We will have two singers also with us this evening. One is Dr. David Castleberry, who is our Director of Choral Activities, and as many people know, a tenor. And also my better half, Linda Dobbs, she's singing soprano tonight. So it's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks so much. It's a real honor for us, and we hope you enjoy the program.
Thank you, Wendell. It's going to be a great evening. It is now my sincere pleasure to introduce the narrator of tonight's presentation, a person whose illustrious name, if not indeed his many accomplishments, is known by nearly all gathered in this room. He is none other than the esteemed academic patriarch of Marshall Academy, the Honorable John O. Laidley of Cabell County, Virginia. Mr. Laidley was born in Morgantown, Virginia in 1791 and was admitted to the bar at the village of Parkersburg in June 1813. A veteran of the War of 1812, he has served for many years as prosecuting attorney of Cabell County and is a former member of the Virginia Commonwealth's House of Delegates. Also, without doubt, he is rightfully acknowledged by one and all alike as the outstanding lawyer in this region of the Old Dominion. John Laidley is a civic-minded man who is interested in providing quality education for the youth of our Guyandotte region. He was a friend and admirer of late Chief Justice John Marshall, with whom he served in the famous Virginia Constitutional Convention of 1829. Thus, it was at Laidley's behest that our recently established academy was named in the honor of our great Chief Justice. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I present to you the Honorable John Osborne Laidley. Mr. Laidley.
I pray you accept my grateful acknowledgments for the honor conferred upon me in appointing me Chief Justice of the United States. I hope never to give you occasion to regret having made this appointment. With these words, John Marshall accepted President John Adams's appointment, made during the waning days of the Adams administration. In so doing, Marshall became the fourth Chief Justice to serve the Supreme Court of the United States. As Chief Justice for 35 years, Marshall transformed the Constitution from a mere compact of the several states into a national union and created a political role for the Supreme Court at the very epicenter of the nation's development. John Marshall was a great man in an era that brought forth great men, men for the ages. Chief Justice John Marshall's tenure spanned the terms of 5 presidents: Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, and Andrew Jackson. Under his leadership, the Supreme Court became a dominant force in American life. The broad powers of the federal government, the authoritative role of the court, which created a legal environment conducive to the growth of the national economy, stem from the decisions that flowed from Marshall's pen. In war, we are one people. In making peace, we are one people. In all commercial regulations, we are one and the same people. In many other aspects, the American people are one, and the government, which is alone capable of controlling and managing their interests in all of these respects, is the government of the Union. The government of the Union, then, is a government of the people. It emanates from them, its powers are granted by them, and are to be exercised directly on them and for their benefit.
strangers free, resolved on death and liberty. Firm, united, let us be, rallying round our liberty. As a band of brothers joined, peace and safety we shall find.
A recounting of Chief Justice Marshall's landmark decisions reads like a primer of American constitutional law. And during the 35 years of his leadership, the court solidified, achieving independence and equality with the other branches of the federal government. The great Chief Justice's imprint is profound. Judicial review, the authority of the Supreme Court to declare acts of the Congress and the executive unconstitutional, traces from his landmark opinion in Marbury versus Madison. The implied powers of the federal government evolved from the decision in McCulloch versus Maryland. In Cohens versus Virginia, the Marshall Court established its jurisdiction over state courts when a federal issue was involved. The sanctity of contracts, a concept that underlies the growth of modern business, found expression in Fletcher versus Peck. The Liberty Doctrine, that institutions of higher learning must remain free from governmentally imposed dictums, ideologies, and domination, has been the touchstone of American higher education for over 2 centuries, and has been the defining difference in our system of education. This principle owes its origins to Marshall's ruling in the famous 1819 Trustees of Dartmouth College versus Woodward case. Equally significant in Gibbons versus Ogden, Marshall struck down state efforts to restrain competition and thereby established the principle of unfettered interstate commerce that characterizes the American economy. And in his circuit court opinion in the United States versus Aaron Burr, Marshall's rigorous interpretation of treason under the Constitution protected basic civil liberties and established the precedent that no one, not even the President of the United States, is above the law. Foremost, Marshall asserted the authority of the Supreme Court to interpret the Constitution. Today, that authority is taken for granted, but it was neither universally recognized nor accepted in 1801. Beginning with Marbury versus Madison, and often in the face of determined opposition, Marshall consistently held that the Constitution was the law of the land, and that in all matters of the law, the decision of the Supreme Court was final. The Constitution rests the whole judicial power of the United States in one Supreme Court. This power is expressly extended to all cases arising under the laws of the United States. A law repugnant to the Constitution is void, and the courts, as well as other departments, are bound by that instrument. It is emphatically the province of and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. During his 35-year tenure as Chief Justice, Marshall gave the court leadership that has never been replicated. He was blessed with a superbly incisive mind, an ability to listen, and a quick, eloquent pen. He was not domineering, but humorous, unpretentious, and open. A Chief Justice who led by consensus and who extracted the best from each of his colleagues. In that respect, the warmth of his personality was as important as the clarity of his intellect. In keeping with his temperament, one of the first things Marshall did after his appointment was to arrange for the justices to board in the same hotel when they were in Washington, D.C. The camaraderie that was fostered by this practice contributed directly to the cohesion and unity of the court. They became a band of brothers. Camaraderie and cohesion were forged in the face of the determined efforts of President Thomas Jefferson to prevent it. Jefferson, the Republican leader of the states' rights movement, was Marshall's second cousin and a bitter political rival in one of the most creative confrontations in American constitutional history. Politically, the two Virginians had already taken measure of one another, and neither liked what he saw. At stake was not just the position of the Supreme Court in American government, but the place of law in a Republican culture. In 1801, President Jefferson noted that his Republican Party, having gained control of the executive and legislative branches of government, must bring the federal judiciary to heel. Nothing, he said, should be spared to eradicate the spirit of martialism from the federal courts. The more Jefferson inveighed against Marshall, the more heroic Marshall became in the eyes of nationalists. Despite Herculean efforts, often couched in vituperative tones, Jefferson failed and Marshall triumphed. During Marshall's stewardship as Chief Justice, the Supreme Court rendered decisions in 1,182 cases. 1,104 were unanimous. By majority decision, known as the opinion of the court, the justices spoke with one voice, and usually that voice was Marshall's. He wrote over half of those decisions. Marshall established the authority of the Supreme Court. He converted it from a weak and fragmented body into the custodian of constitutional legitimacy. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said it best: if American law were to be represented by a single figure, skeptic and worshiper alike would agree that that figure would be one alone, and that one, John Marshall. As once observed by Professor Jean Edward Smith, three statesmen, above all others, forged the American Republic: George Washington, who founded it; Abraham Lincoln, who preserved it; and John Marshall, who defined it. Perhaps it is not surprising that in the wake of his great constitutional opinions, Marshall's personal qualities have all been but forgotten. His personal life has been obscured by his profound judicial achievements, and less is known of John Marshall than of any other great American. Virginia was a great frontier in the 18th century, filled with strong-willed people. Marshall's father, Thomas Marshall, was one of them. He started with little except ambition and rose to become one of the leading men in colonial Virginia. Thomas Marshall worked with his friend George Washington as a surveyor. He was also a successful farmer and a man who married well. Marshall's wife, Mary Randolph Keith, came from a prominent and distinguished Virginia family. In September 1755, the couple had their first of 15 children. That was John Marshall. He was born in a simple wooden cabin in what was to become Fauquier County, at the foot of the Blue Ridge Mountains, then on the remote reaches of Virginia's raw northwest frontier. Fauquier County had little to offer by way of schools, but Marshall's parents were unusually committed to education and schooled their children at home. Marshall's brief formal education began at age 14 when his father sent him to Campbelltown Academy in Westmoreland County, Virginia, for 1 year. There he developed proficiency in basic skills and an introduction to Latin. Ultimately, Marshall mastered Greek and Latin and read the classics. Later in life, John Marshall confirmed that his father was a far abler man than any of his sons and the solid foundation of all my success. Following the clash of arms in April 1775 between British regulars and Massachusetts militia at Lexington Bridge and on Concord Green, the long-anticipated war for American independence began. John Marshall joined the Revolution in the summer of 1775 when he arrived at the muster field for the Culpeper Militia, located near Germantown in frontier Fauquier County. He walked 10 miles to get there from the family home at Oak Hill. A young, lanky 19-year-old frontiersman who came with high resolve appeared wearing his purple-dyed hunting shirt and a beaver hat. A tomahawk hung at his side and a rifle in his hand. In the course of the war, he participated in the conflict from several vantage points, as a lieutenant in the militia, as an officer in the 11th Virginia Regiment of Washington's Continental Line, and in November 1777, as a deputy judge advocate attached to Washington's staff. He saw action at the Battle of the Great Bridge, Virginia, skirmished with British regulars at Iron Hill, Delaware, was with Washington at Monmouth, and fought with General Mad Anthony Wayne at the capture of Stony Point. In the Pennsylvania campaign during 1777, he fought at Brandywine Creek, at Chadds Ford, and Germantown. He went into winter quarters with Washington at Valley Forge. There, the young lieutenant, attached to Daniel Morgan's elite corps of Virginia sharpshooters, demonstrated his athletic prowess by winning foot races and jumping contests, which caught the attention of the troops and earned him the nickname Silver Heels. It was while wintering at Valley Forge that the young John Marshall fell completely under the spell of George Washington. Marshall later called the general the greatest man on earth and began his lifelong role as the champion of Washington's legacy in American history. Marshall wrote the definitive Washington biography of his time and subsequently imposed for all time his and Washington's hopes for America's future in landmark decisions as the nation's preeminent jurist and most influential interpreter of the Constitution. Moreover, like so many other young men who fought in the War for Independence, he would become an ardent nationalist. I was confirmed in the habit of considering America as my country and Congress as my government. I have imbibed these sentiments so thoroughly that they constituted a part of my being. Soldiering under Washington during the Revolution had made him a nationalist.
Soldier no more, but
Near the end of the war, Marshall attended the lectures of Chancellor George Wythe at William and Mary, the first course of legal education offered in the United States. He was admitted to the bar on August 28, 1780, and within 10 years, he had become the leading appellate lawyer in Virginia. He was also the personal attorney of George Washington and George Mason. Marshall's life had been interrupted for 6 years while he served in the military. At age 25, he was anxious to move on, to establish his practice, to earn money, to bring honor to his name, all with one principal purpose in mind: to make Miss Mary Willis Ambler his wife. The two young people first met at Yorktown during the winter of 1779 and 80. The Amblers were a prominent family led by Jacqueline Ambler, who later was elected Virginia's state treasurer and was also the richest man in Virginia at the time. Family legend holds that when John asked Polly, as Mary Ambler was affectionately known, for her hand in marriage, she refused him. The young suitor left in a huff, except for the intervention of Polly's cousin, John Ambler, who took a lock of Polly's hair to Marshall as a peace offering. That rejection might have been the end. However, all ended well. The lovers were married on January 3rd, 1783, and set up housekeeping in Richmond. Polly had the locket made to hold the strand of hair from her courtship and wore it until her death. On Christmas Eve, 1831, she removed the locket and placed it around her husband's neck. The next day, Polly died. Marshall wore it for the remainder of his life. John Marshall's family life was not without tragedy. The Marshalls bore a total of 10 offspring, but lost 4 infants to early death. Polly never recovered from the heartbreak. She would suffer from an acute form of chronic depression and became progressively more fragile physically and mentally until her death. As a result, Marshall assumed a larger share of domestic decision-making than he otherwise would have done. In big things as well as small, including doing the marketing, his concern was to make life secure for his family and comfortable for Polly. There were gloves for her hands, ribbons for her hair, a fine carriage so she could ride in style, and he built a house for her close to her mother's home. Marshall always made sure that the couple left Richmond to stay on their farm on the Chickahominy River northeast of the city during the times of national rejoicing, such as the 4th of July, Christmas, and Washington's birthday. While ministering to a growing family, John Marshall also entered fully into Richmond's community life. By all accounts, even those of his Republican adversaries, he was a most likable man. Throughout his life, Marshall entertained generously and was a popular favorite in several of Richmond's men's clubs. His contemporaries spoke affectionately of his attachments to pleasure with convivial habits strongly fixed. According to Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, Marshall was a model of simplicity, ready to laugh, to joke, and to be joked with. Joseph Story, Marshall's longtime colleague, said of him, "The first impression of a stranger was generally that of disappointment. It seemed hardly credible that such simplicity should be the accompaniment of such acknowledged greatness." Story continued, "His laughter was chaste and plain, and his laugh too hearty for an intriguer. His good temper and unwearied patience are equally agreeable on the bench and in the study." Even though Virginia, and especially Richmond, was a hotbed of states' rights, Marshall was well liked and respected. He almost invariably retained the friendship of his political opponents. Marshall was always congenial and did not make enemies easily. He and James Madison were always good friends. James Monroe had been close since childhood, and the redoubtable Patrick Henry, the most radical of great Virginians, remained a friend and admirer. John Marshall was deeply rooted in Richmond's rich and varied social life. He was a charter member of the city's famous Quoits Club, where he was not only a formidable competitor, but also the chief judge of disputed points. The club was also famous for its lavish barbecue picnics and a potent punch concocted by Marshall containing brandy, rum, and Madeira, poured into a bowl, 1/3 filled with ice and sweetened, with lemons added for garnish. Yes, John Marshall was an excellent host. His table was graced by high spirits, sumptuous food, and fine wines from a well-stocked cellar. Indeed, Marshall loved Madeira. He bought it by the pipe, an old English measurement corresponding to 126 gallons. Richmond residents grew accustomed to seeing the tall, ungainly, negligently dressed Chief Justice shopping in the farmer's market. He never hurried and habitually lingered at the market stalls, chatting and learning the latest gossip. However, Richmond residents were not as well prepared for the sight of the Chief Justice, mop in hand, leading his servants in weekly house cleaning. Callers at the Marshall home reported seeing him with his sleeves rolled up and a handkerchief tied about his head, helping to scrub the floors and set the house in order. Over the years, there developed an impressive body of anecdotes about Marshall in Richmond. One of the most frequently repeated has the sloppily dressed Chief Justice at the local market being offered a small coin by an unwitting stranger to carry a turkey home. He took the job and was paid for his services. Of the incident, Marshall kindly noted that we were going the same way and it seemed only neighborly. Whether this and similar stories are true is not known, but the fact that there are such stories says something about Marshall's status as a local legend. While establishing himself in his law practice in Richmond, John Marshall assumed a variety of public duties, becoming of a virtuous and responsible citizen. During 2 decades of public service, John Marshall never lost an election. He served on the Richmond City Council, represented Richmond, and played a pivotal role in the Constitutional Convention in 1788, which ratified our federal Constitution. He served in the Virginia House of Delegates and later as a delegate to the State Constitutional Convention in 1829. And when the legislature wanted to explore internal improvements in 1812, it chose Marshall to head the commission and write the report. Parenthetically, Marshall, at the age of 57, led the 20-man survey party himself up the James River, portaged over the mountains, down the Greenbrier and New Rivers, and on the Great Kanawha. He was a lay leader in Richmond's Episcopal Church, an active Mason, a benefactor and founder of Richmond's first fire department, and a member of the Board of Trustees at William and Mary College. On the national level, in 1793, he declined President Washington's offer to become the United States Attorney for Virginia, and in 1795 turned down the opportunity to become Attorney General. Eventually, President John Adams induced him to go to Paris as one of 3 special emissaries to settle serious differences with revolutionary France. In that capacity, Marshall refused to provide a bribe to Foreign Minister Talleyrand, the famous XYZ affair, and returned to the United States as the hero of the hour. In 1798, at Washington's behest, he ran for and was elected to Congress, became the floor leader of moderate Federalists in the House of Representatives, and in 1800 was appointed Secretary of State. When Oliver Ellsworth resigned as Chief Justice, Adams nominated Marshall to succeed him. Some years later, John Adams wrote to John Marshall, "There is no part of my life that I look back upon with more pleasure than the time I spent with you. And it is the pride of my life that I have given this nation a Chief Justice equal to Cook or Hale, Holt or Mansfield, these the greatest of England's jurists."
Sing Yankee Doodle, that fine tune Americans delight in. It's used for peace, it's used for fun, it's used as well for fighting. The president with good intent, 3 envoys sent to Paris, but Sancton would not treat them well, of honor rank so there is. Yankee Doodle, mind the tune, Yankee Doodle dandy. If Frenchmen come with naked bumpers, spank them hard and handy.
Spank them hard and handy.
But Marshall came with trump of fame and brought the noble answer. Without a joke he had him so the round tally ran, sir. Americans then fly to arms and learn the way to use them. If each man's fight to vent his rights, the French can long abuse them. Yankee Doodle, mind the tune, Yankee Doodle dandy. If Frenchmen come with naked bumpers, spank them hard and handy. Let every man adopt his plan, like brothers stick together, then all the threats of violence and death will never weigh a feather. Yankee Doodle, mind the tune, Yankee Doodle dandy. If Frenchmen come with naked bumpers, spank them hard and handy.
Life on the Virginia frontier had developed in John Marshall a robust stamina. Well into his 70s, the Chief Justice walked 6 miles a day, usually at the quick step of the Revolutionary War's light infantry. Late in his life, he was still pitching quoits on Saturday afternoons and enjoying the club's powerful rum punch. However, in his late 70s, Marshall's health was failing. In early June 1835, while visiting Polly's grave, he collapsed in tremendous pain. He traveled to Philadelphia for treatment, but the doctors could do nothing. He was dying. Present during his final hours were his sons, except for Thomas, the eldest, who, unbeknownst to his father, was killed in a freak accident on his way to join him. John Marshall died at 6 o'clock on the evening of July 6, 1835, still wearing Polly's locket. He was 79 years old. His final words, according to Justice Story, were a prayer for the Union. On July 8, 1835, as the Marshall funeral cortege moved slowly through the streets of Philadelphia, muffled bells reverberated the solemn message. Then suddenly the great Liberty Bell in Independence Hall went silent. It had cracked while tolling the death of the great Chief Justice. It never tolled again. John Marshall was buried next to his beloved Polly at the Shockoe Hill Cemetery in Richmond. The words on his gravestone were written by himself 2 days before he died, leaving nothing but the final date to be affixed. The modest inscription reads, John Marshall, son of Thomas and Mary Marshall, was born the 24th of September, 1755. Intermarried with Mary Willis Ambler, the 3rd of January, 1783, departed this life the 6th day of July, 1835. John Marshall's modesty, so apparent in all that he did and said, stemmed from a quality rare among the great men of the early republic. He was genuinely a modest man. The more famous he became, the more modest he grew. What Thomas Babington Macaulay said of John Hampden fits Marshall exactly. He was an almost solitary instance of a great man who neither sought nor shunned greatness, who found glory only because glory lay in the plain path of duty. Ironically, although less is known about John Marshall than any other great American statesman, he is the greatest living legacy. The great Chief Justice affixed his stamp on the Supreme Court as an institution, and when the court goes about its work, it keeps his legacy alive. The daily practice of American law makes John Marshall uniquely relevant. Over its long history, the Supreme Court has cited Marshall's great opinions innumerable times. His name and his ideals still command attention in the actual work of the court as it serves the American nation he so deeply loved and defined. Rarely does one have the privilege of sharing a stage with such talented musicians. Please join me in thanking and showing our appreciation to these extraordinary musical performers once again. Linda Dobbs, soprano, David Castleberry, tenor, Wendel Dobbs on the flute, Stephen Lawson on the horn, Kay Lawson, bassoon, Ben Miller, percussion, Leslie Pettis, pianoforte, Kay Wildman, harpsichord, and Reed Smith on the violin. Outstanding. At this time, I would like to invite Pat Doherty to the podium to make a very special presentation this evening. Pat?
This is certainly a special occasion as we come together to celebrate the 219th anniversary of our Constitution. The Constitution, adopted by a convention of our nation's founders on September 17, 1787, is cause for celebration today and every day. It is a great privilege and an honor for me to be here this evening to present the Constitution Certificate from the National Society, Daughters of the American Revolution, to Dr. Alan B. Gould. Dr. Gould. Thank you. This is for his outstanding leadership as coordinator of the Constitution Week for the activities at Marshall University. Dr. Gould, this is your certificate, and I wanted to read it to you. The Constitution Week Committee Certificate Award presented to Dr. Alan B. Gould in recognition of outstanding work in upholding and promoting the ideals of the Constitution of the United States of America. And this is signed by the President General of the National Society, Daughters of the American Revolution, Presley Merritt Wagner.
Well, thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
You've done a wonderful job.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. And thank you all for your kind attendance this evening, and enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you.